6 days after election, and we still have the left rolling in fits on the floor, trying to swallow their tongue, trying to lash out at everybody. We've got film director Paul Schrader calling for violence to stop Donald Trump. And, of course, I think it's interesting that this is a guy who was involved with films like Taxi Driver, The Last Temptation of Christ. Yeah, that was a fine film, wasn't it? Last Temptation of Christ. Great job there. And Taxi Driver, you know, where you got this vigilante, this very dark film. You know, this vigilante who is into pornography. He falls in love with his child, a prostitute. Hinckley said it inspired him to come after Ronald Reagan. So maybe this film director is hoping that he can inspire somebody to come after Donald Trump. And he's allowed to say this kind of stuff on Facebook. Listen to what he had to say. This is an article that's up on Infowars.com by Paul Joseph Watson. Film director Paul Schrader calls for violence to stop Donald Trump. Here's what he said in his Facebook post. I've spent the last 5 days meditating on Trump's election. Upon consideration, I believe this is a call to violence. And he says, I felt the call to violence in the 60s, and I feel it again now. Oh, maybe that's part of what they try to reflect in Taxi Driver. But he goes on to say, we should finance those who support violent resistance. Interesting. Not only calling for the assassination of a president, calling for violent resistance, but also saying you should finance that. He said, we should be willing to take arms like old John Brown. I'm willing to battle with my children. Well, you know, John Brown was an idiot who got a lot of people killed, mostly his friends, okay? And he laid the groundwork for the Civil War because he got people in the South very concerned there's going to be an uprising, even though he wasn't successful in getting an uprising going. And I have to ask, you know, as I did in the last segment, where is the Southern Poverty Law Center? Always the guardians against hatred and violence, against the calls for assassination, so they say. No, when somebody on the left does it, it's just absolutely fine. So also with the Anti-Defamation League, they don't have anything to say about somebody like this. It's just fine for him to call for that. We got the Trump campaign manager telling Democrats, this is Kellyanne Conway, tell your violent protesters to stop. She says it's really time for President Obama and Secretary Clinton to say to these protesters, this man is our president. Well, you know, they're getting close to the point where they're calling out Soros on it, and that's really what they need to do. They need to call Soros out, and they need to call out people like Paul Schrader, and they need to say, if you're going to call on social media, openly call on social, how many times do we see little guys? Okay, there's a different standard of law, isn't there, for the ordinary person versus the well-known person. See, Hillary Clinton can do whatever she wants to national security. She can have the biggest leak of national security we have ever seen, both in terms of quantity and quality. The biggest overthrow of national security we've ever seen. And yet she gets a pass. You know, bigger than the spies on the inside, Philby Burgess McLean that betrayed the British intelligence back then. It was bigger than that. And yet she gets a pass. And then we see small guys, little guys, who the guy in the submarine who takes a couple of pictures as a souvenir for himself. And those are things that would be classified as confidential. That is the lowest level of classification. And I'm telling you, at one point I got classification for confidential. It was my first job. It was a co-op job that I had when I was in college as engineering. And I had to get a confidential classification, and it was nothing. The stuff that they classified as confidential is like, seriously? They think this is a secret? They think nobody knows this? This is a joke, and it was a joke to get confidential classification. They went over and they talked to a couple of my neighbors who had known me for a long time. Yeah, he's fine. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, you had to do basically nothing to get there. On the other hand, Hillary Clinton gets Huma Abedin, somebody who had only been in the country for 2 years, somebody had close ties to a foreign government, the Saudis, and gets her top secret clearance. And that's a big difference. There's orders, it's exponentially different between the different levels of classification, going from confidential to secret and then from secret to top secret. It's kind of like, if you think about it, an earthquake, seismic, the measurements, they go up exponentially, okay? There's a big difference between a Richter scale of 7 and one of 8, okay? And that's the way it is with the classification settings because they've only got 3 of them. Of course, there is above top secret. Hillary leaked that as well, but they give her a pass, and then they nail these other people. So we got people like this film director. We got people like this CEO. This is another article that's up on Infowars.com. Company places its own CEO on leave after he threatens to assassinate Trump. He says, I'm getting a sniper rifle, gonna go kill the president-elect. I put on here, this guy's the CEO of something called Packet Sled, a risk management company. Hey, maybe you didn't do the risk analysis when you opened your big mouth on social media. I mean, give me a break. You write something like that on social media. If this was a college student, if this was a black guy in the inner city or a white guy in the inner city or whatever that was poor, you would have the FBI coming in and you would be arrested. We had a guy, I remember when Gerald Ford came to our university to campaign, and there was a guy that I knew indirectly, knew of, he wasn't a friend of mine, and he shows up at the rally with a toy pistol. The Secret Service wrestled him down to the ground, and we never saw him again. I don't know what happened to the guy. I don't know if he was incarcerated. I don't know if, we've had Steve Pachenik talk about, the kind of nut jobs that want attention or think they're going to do something. The Travis Bickles, the people, the taxi driver type guys. And he said, yeah, we take them over for psychological evaluation. They just disappear. I mean, words to that effect. But so I don't know what happened to that guy. He never came back to school, though. I can tell you that. But one of the things we need to say is they need to start getting tough about this because they're talking about killing people. And these are people at the upper level. You're going to tolerate that. Those calls to assassination from people who are CEOs, from people who are bigwigs in Hollywood, and saying that we're going to fund violence. I don't think that should be tolerated, quite frankly. I don't want to live in a violent world. I want to see a lot of change. I want to see, honestly, I want to see more change than these people do. But I want to see it done peacefully. Let's try it peacefully at first. Want a path to some peaceful change here. Let's go with that. And let's shut down these people who are calling for violence, who are plotting this. And we need to do it by saying we're going to pull up criminal charges for inciting violence. We're going to pull up criminal charges for calling for the assassination of a president. We're going to go after Soros for funding this violence, okay? We're not going to let them create a situation of martial law. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to foment this violence, hoping that there will be a backlash and a martial law, and then they'll say, look, he's a dictator. We always told you all along he's a dictator. No, they need to use the law to shut down these people who do this, just like they would if it was Joe Blow sitting at his computer who didn't have any power. Isn't that interesting? The people who really don't have any power to make this happen, nothing happens to them. Or they get arrested, but the people who do have power to make it happen, they get to say this stuff and keep going. Now, a couple more news items before I get into the Electoral College and why it's a good thing, why the founders have saved us yet again. And I don't believe that Hillary won the popular vote by 1 million votes. We have an article up at Infowars.com. Paul Joseph Watson quoting someone who looks at voter fraud, who believes that there were 3 million illegal aliens who voted. And let me just break that down for Gary Johnson, because remember he went apoplectic when somebody used the term illegal alien. Alien means that you're not a citizen. Illegal means that you're here without getting following any legal procedure that we have for people to visit our country or to immigrate into our country. It's a very useful term. It really defines it. They're not simply immigrants, and they're not simply undocumented. They're undocumented because they've chosen to ignore and thumb their noses at the law. So we've got undocumented voters. We need to do something about this. As I said before we went to commercial break, now is the time for us to say we're not going to allow this massive interjection of computerized machines operating under easily hacked software to run our elections. And we ought to be able to do this with the cooperation of people on the left of goodwill, people who are Democrats, people who are independents. Everybody ought to want honest elections and ought to want to do what is necessary to get rid of this corruption that we see. We ought to start by getting rid of these voting machines. We need to reinstate the processes like we were trying to do here in Texas, reinstate the processes of allowing us to have capability of auditing the vote afterwards. Why wouldn't you want to have that? Let's just go back to paper ballots because that's what you're going to need to have to audit the votes anyway. So let's take a look at this thing about why Trump picked Reince Priebus as chief of staff. This is another article up on Infowars.com by Kit Daniels. And basically, folks, this is the old expression, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Kit points out that by selecting him as chief of staff, he's using an age-old strategy to keep former enemies close so they don't rebel. He draws parallels to Louis XIV and others who historically have done this. I've got to say, I did a double take when I saw this. As people were floating Priebus's name, I thought, no, seriously, he can't be considering to do Priebus because Priebus was running the RNC, and the RNC gave not a cent to Donald Trump, after having given $50 million to the previous two Republican candidates, Romney and McCain. That was essentially, it wasn't just that they didn't give any money to Donald Trump. It was like giving a $50 million gift to Hillary Clinton, wasn't it? Because that $50 million isn't just running pro-Trump ads, it's running anti-Hillary ads. That was something that would have helped Republicans. They may not have lost any seats if they had done their job, if they had run against Hillary Clinton as the person who is in charge of a party that has embraced her corruption. I mean, they could have used that all up and down the line, but they chose to set that out. And so I don't see Priebus as an ally of Donald Trump. I really do believe, like Kit Daniels said, that what he's doing is keeping his enemies closer. I think that's a wise thing to do. And, of course, Bannon is going to be there. He's kind of split the duties of the chief of staff between Reince Priebus and Bannon from Breitbart. So that'll be good. That'll be good to have opposing views and also to keep his enemy close to him. One other news article I want to get to before we get to the Electoral College, and that is something that came up at the end of last week. It was on the Drudge Report. You may have seen it. Internet Movie Database is suing the state of California over a law requiring their website to remove an actor's age. Now, many of you may have used IMDb. I use it all the time. We look up information. We cross-reference movies and directors. You know, like this guy who was calling for violence against Donald Trump, who was a taxi driver. Anyway, IMDb is a great source of information, but one of the things they have on there, you look up an actor or an actress, and they'll tell you their name. And in Hollywood, they don't like that. But that's too bad. I'm really sorry for them, but this is a very important principle. It's one of the reasons I think that Matt Drudge picked up on this. It's very key. If we allow this to stand, you have to understand it sets a principle that the government can come in and regulate content. It is a massive violation of free speech. They're not saying something untrue about these people. I mean, if they had their age wrong, that would be one thing. This is not slander. It's not libel. It is telling the truth about somebody. And if you can't tell the truth about somebody, even if it's something as unpleasant as their age or the number of spouses that they've had or the number of plastic surgeries they've had or whatever, even if you can't say something if you can't say something's true about these people, then they have really put the camel's nose under the tent. And this is something that is going to be used to overturn anything in principle. If you accept that principle, then basically you have eviscerated the First Amendment, because the First Amendment stands unless you say something that is untrue about somebody. And it should be that way. So that's a very important case. And again, notice where it's coming from. California. California. That's why I said, and I got a lot of people push back on Twitter. If you want to follow me there, it's Libertarian is my Twitter handle. A lot of people push back on it when I said, let them go. Please let them go. Don't. I said they don't want to wait for the San Andreas fault to do the work for them and separate them from the United States. They want to go ahead and do it right now. Go ahead. What can I do to help you leave? And, of course, there's a lot of conservative areas in California, Northern California, Southern Oregon. They have tried to secede. The state of Jefferson is what they wanted to call it. Not secede from the United States, but just to secede from those two crazy governments that they're stuck with in California and Oregon. And I believe they ought to be able to do that. That's why when you look at Ukraine leaving Russia, it's like, okay, fine. And the American politicians, the State Department celebrated that. But then when Crimea wanted to leave Ukraine, they said, no, you can't do that. See, it's always that way, isn't it? Going back to the Civil War, as that was coming up, the western part of Virginia said, no, we don't want to secede from the Union. We're going to stay. And so Virginia said, okay, fine. We believe in the principle of secession. That's what this country was founded upon. And so you can go your own way. We'll, create your own state. They created West Virginia. And, of course, it remained that way. The federal government said, we'll recognize West Virginia, but we won't recognize Virginia's right of secession. It's always that way. It's always the double standard.
Talk show host is Alex Jones. He's a conspiracy theorist.
Radio talk show host Alex Jones.
Alex Jones.
Jones is the wildly popular conspiracy theorist.
Radio talk show host and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones.
Deeply, I think, racist.
I just got called racist by MSNBC.
I don't want that man to have a gun.